friends, my name is Chloe. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be chatting through some of my reading stats for the year 2020, as well as my reading goals for the year 2021. 2020 was the best and in many ways kind of the only reading year I've had. My love for reading was really rekindled in 2019, and 2020 is when I really started to read a lot again. First off, we'll start with numbers. I think obvious caveat here that if you consider yourself a reader, you are a reader and the number doesn't matter. That said, I'm pretty happy with how much reading I managed to do this year. I read 115 books for a total of 32,618 pages, which is it's wild. My reading goal at the beginning of the year, I think I had set it to 25 books. And that felt really ambitious at the time. My average number of pages per book is 283, which makes sense. I am not the person reading 600-page fantasy books. I love when a book can capture me and pull me in and tell a great story, not in 700 pages. The most popular book that I read this year, or the book that has the most shelves on Goodreads, is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, which over 8 million people had shelved. Not really surprising. I read The Hunger Games for the first time this year. I gave it 4 stars. I really liked it. The least popular book that I read is Bootstraps Need Boots, One Tory's Lonely Fight to End Poverty in Canada by Hugh Segal. This is a memoir of a former politician in Canada who spent his life fighting for a basic income. I also really enjoyed this. My reading changed a lot over the months of the year. So whereas at the beginning of the year, I read 1 book in January, 1 book in February, 2 books in March, and then it was really only in August where my reading really picked up, where I started reading 16, 17, 18 books per month. And interestingly, my reading shooting up also coincided with me starting a booktube channel, which is kind of interesting because I definitely had a concern that I was going to start booktube and that was going to take up so much time that I wasn't going to be doing reading anymore. And actually the opposite happened, where booktube really kind of prompted me and inspired me to read more. So that was a pleasant surprise. In terms of genres, this was actually a little bit surprising to me, where by far the genre that I read the most from this year was YA or young adult. And I guess in some ways this shouldn't be surprising, but in some ways it is. If you've been watching my videos, you know that I have a little bit of a tough relationship with YA, where often I feel like they don't quite give me what I'm looking for. I don't find them super relatable because I'm maybe no longer the target audience, which is scary and sad. But that said, when I find a YA that hits, I love it. And some of my favorite books of the year were YA books. The second most common genre that I read from was LGBTQIA+ books, which is not surprising to me. And then we've got literary, thriller, fantasy, and biography as other popular genres that I read from. Fantasy was surprising for me, but I looked through the books that were classified as fantasy on Storygraph, and a lot of them were speculative fiction, low fantasy, meaning they were set in a kind of quote-unquote real world, which makes sense because I do very much like books that have magical elements set in like a real world setting. Just over a quarter of the books that I read were nonfiction books. This actually surprised me because I felt like I wasn't reading a lot of nonfiction this year. So over a quarter, I felt pretty good about that. And this was another funny one that Storygraph does. It classifies the moods of your reading. And this one I kind of found surprising as well, that over quite a bit over half of the books that I read in 2020 could be classified as being emotional, reflective, challenging, dark, or mysterious. When I look at my favorite books, that does make sense. I think in my head, I think that I'm reading like happy, light fluff, and that's maybe actually not what's happening in real life. So that's interesting. In terms of stats and numbers, 3 other things that I wanted to share. I did want to kind of get a sense of how diversely I was reading. These things are really important to me, that I'm reading from diverse and underrepresented perspectives, and that I'm wanting to use reading to broaden my own horizons and learn new things, and at least in my own reading, decenter kind of the narratives and stories that we hear about most often. Again, I think all of these things that I'm going to talk about are imperfect measurements because they're things that I looked at and made a decision what to classify things as. This is imperfect, but I still think it's important to share. The first of which is gender. I'm treating this in a sort of binary sense, not in the traditional way, but I actually wanted to calculate the number of books that I read by cisgender men, so people who identify as men and were assigned male at birth, and not cisgender men. So in that, I'm categorizing cis women, trans men, non-binary folks, anybody that is not a cis man. And really the most important thing was to me, how much of my reading time am I dedicating to cisgender men? And the answer is not a lot. Of the 115 books that I read this year, 17 or just under 15% were written by cis men. Over 85.3% were written by women or gender minorities. So I feel pretty good about that. That doesn't really surprise me. A lot of the genres that are really dominated by cis men are not ones that I really read from. I don't read a ton of thriller, and I don't read a ton of fantasy or horror. The second one that I wanted to track was the number of books that I was reading by BIPOC authors, so authors who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Again, an imperfect calculation on my part because I am looking at the author's bio and trying to figure out whether they identify within that category. Again, imperfect, but I think something that's important to take into account. We know that the writing and publishing industry are very white. Of the 115 books that I read this year, 65 were written by BIPOC authors, so that's 56.5%. I don't have a reaction to that number. I'm happy that that number is over 50%. The third kind of stat measurement that I very loosely tracked was 2S LGBTQIA+ books. I think that this one's tricky because I think we have seen this year in the book community that assuming an author's gender identity or sexual orientation is not only tough but can be really harmful. So in this I looked at whether queer folks, queer themes, queer issues were a major theme in the book, as well as how authors self-identified. And here I had 42 out of 115 books, or 36.5%. This one I actually did think was going to be a little bit higher, but I still feel pretty happy about that. That's over a third of my reading. Again, I think for that kind of diversity piece, it's something that's important to me more as an accountability measure for myself. I'm sure I can always be doing better, and there are a lot of different kind of identities and social locations that I have not included in this list. I would love to read more books by disabled authors, books that are translated, books that are not kind of centered on or published in the quote-unquote global north. Let me know if you track any of the same things, if there were any kind of reading stats that really stood out to you this year. Part 2 of this video, I wanted to quickly share some of my reading goals for 2021. So I've written down 5 goals. They're pretty loose, I would say. And the first is just in terms of number of books that I want to read. I have set my reading goal for the year to 100 books. I think it will be probably achievable. In a really ideal world, I would love to read more books in 2021 than I read in 2020, but I don't want to set myself up for failure. Number 2 is continuing to read diversely. I think I'd like to look at the numbers that I have this year and keep them there or improve them. I would be curious if anyone watching this has set sort of specific, measurable goals in terms of diversity in their reading. I'd be curious to hear what those are. Number 3, and this I am partway there already, is switching to Storygraph. So Goodreads is the app that almost everybody, I think, in the book community uses to track their reading, the books that they've read, the books that they want to read, and see what other people are up to. Goodreads is owned by Amazon, and as I think complicated as the politics of Amazon are, and they are, we don't really want to be giving more money to Jeff Bezos if we don't have to be, and thankfully we don't have to be because there is a new alternative to Goodreads, and that is called Storygraph, which is quite similar in terms of what the app is designed for, but actually has a lot of really cool additional features, including some of the stats that I showed here, but also in terms of setting and finding really cool and unique and specific reading challenges. It provides you with really tailored and specific book recommendations based on your preferences or what you're in the mood for. I am in the process of making that switch. Right now I'm kind of using both simultaneously. It makes it pretty easy for you to export your Goodreads library over to Storygraph. I would love to be kind of fully using that and not relying so heavily on Goodreads by the end of the year. The 4th goal that I have is to be more intentional about my physical books. And I mean this in 2 ways. I think the first is obviously buying books. I'm a pretty bad book buyer, and especially because I buy so many of my books secondhand, it's really easy for me to see a book for $3 that I would read, but is not a top priority for me, and then I buy it and then I take it home and then it sits on my shelf for a really, really long time. So I want to be really more intentional about the books that I'm bringing home with me, and I also want to be more intentional about the books that I am keeping, and keeping the books that bring me joy. I do not need to keep 3-star reads on my shelf. I don't need to keep all 4-star reads on my shelves, if we're being completely honest. And the 5th reading or reading related goal is to continue to work on and commit to and grow on my baby booktube channel. This has been really, really fun for me for these first couple months as a way to share more about my reading as well as connect with other people. So I'm really excited. I've got some fun ideas for 2021 and I would love to continue to connect with folks and grow my channel and post more videos about books. There we have it. There are my stats for 2020 and looking forward, my goals for 2021. Let me know if anything has surprised you about my stats, if there's a stat from your reading that you wanted to share, and let me know what your reading goals are for 2021, whether that's number of books, a book buying ban, using the library more, any of these. Let me know what your reading goals are for 2021. I would love to chat more in the comments. I will be coming at you soon, hopefully, fingers crossed, in the next couple days with my favorites of 2020 video. I'm super excited about this. Spoiler, it might be 2 videos instead of 1 because your girl cannot make decisions. But in the meantime, have a fantastic day, have a fantastic week, and I will see you next time. Bye.